Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Lorandom podcast. I'm your host, Peter Bauman, the editor-in-chief at Lorandom, and today we are continuing our Friday episodes as a companion to our Monday editorials. And today's episode is with the artist and filmmaker, Lawrence Lek. And our Monday editorial this week was by the great Luba Elliott, who was the co-chair of the creative AI track at NeurIPS in December, which is the world's preeminent annual AI conference. So Elliott then chose two standout works out of over 90 submissions to dive deeper into, speaking with the artist of those pieces, and they were Ethan Chang and Quincy Kwong, who presented the stochastic parrot, a physical AI cohabitant. And then she also spoke with Jin Lung and Chloe Loeth, authors of Assembloid Agency, which is this fascinating work, which is an open source Unreal Engine plugin that connects to living neurons grown on a brain on a chip. So super interesting, both of those projects. And of course, Luba is a legend, so definitely check that out. But today I speak with an artist that I endlessly reference, but also admire, and that's the simulation artist, Lawrence Lek. We discuss his new work, NOX Pavilion, at the Bass Museum of Art in Miami. It's this exhibition focusing on a self-driving car undergoing therapy. What's fascinating about this exhibition is that it centers the detrimental impact that humans can have on other intelligences. And Lek views the work as this exploration of non-human psychological issues and rights and the relationship between care and control and AI. So the work raises all these fascinating questions. We then go on to discuss one of my favorite topics, and something that Lek is also quite interested in, which is the concept of worlds. And Lek talks a lot about Umwelt and emphasizing that a world is not one particular thing, but many different entry points into alternative realities. And so Lek is genuinely one of my favorite artists to speak with, and I can't wait to share it. So let's begin. Yeah, thank you so much for taking the time. And yeah, I've been looking forward to this chat. And I guess there's sort of three main topics that I wanted to talk about. And one is your new work, NOX Pavilion, and then just sort of the questions and issues that arise from it. And then I also want to talk quite a bit about worlds and like your idea of worlds, which is, I know, something that you're very interested in. And it's something that, yeah, that I think is just growing in importance, and I think will continue. And then yeah, and then maybe at the end there's a bit of more of like a grab bag, some questions about like consent and things like that. But yeah, so I guess a good place to start would be about your current exhibition, which is NOX Pavilion, and it's at the Bass Museum of Art in Miami. I think it's been on since December, and then it's going until, is it April? What I found interesting about this show, but also just, I guess, your work in general, is that like this show is looking at the detrimental impact that humans have on intelligent machines. So it's usually, I guess, usually it's framed or thought about, the other way around. Or I'm curious, like, how this project builds on your previous inquiries into this topic with NOX, and yeah, maybe that's a good place to start.
Great. Yeah, thanks a lot, Peter. So the show on at the Bass at the moment, Bass Museum in Miami, is called NOX Pavilion, which is the third iteration, or actually the third version of an ongoing project called NOX, which is basically around the speculative idea of a rehab center for bad self-driving cars. First, about the title, like NOX it's in my fictional world, it's an acronym for non-human excellence. So it's a kind of, I guess, euphemism for a retraining program that is a bit more, how should I say, like a bit more strict and disciplined than like actual, good old fashioned like therapy, let's say. This also relates to my ongoing inquiry, I guess, into like this idea of non-human characters, both in video games and in, I guess, cinema and film and literature and digital art as well. And lately, the main character is really like the AI or like these robot characters. In the case of NOX, the protagonist, if I can call it that, is a self-driving car undergoing therapy, and the other characters are like Guan Yin, this AI therapist, basically, that the company integrates into their self-driving cars because the company has already knows from persistent data training that their self-driving cars are like sentient, intelligent, but get really depressed because of the nature of their job. So of course it's talking about, I guess, what I would call like my own personal concerns about the nature of creative practice or work in general in the 21st century. And I obviously care about these different characters in my films, but they're all, I feel like, reflections on my observations of just talking to friends or responding to the world. So this idea of like empathy towards these new characters is coming from quite a personal place, but it's also got a strong political and social angle to it. According to what you were saying about, it's interesting what you're saying, the framing about this detrimental impact on technology. When you said that, I was actually thinking about the ecological movement since the 50s and 60s, and that reframing of like the default state of essentially like humanity extracting from nature and from natural resources of all forms and from other people if possible. And that shift that happened really with the whole earth kind of movements in the 60s and 70s that made people conscious about things that led up to new ideas about the rights of nature, legal status of non-human things, agency of different forms of intelligence, and all these things being caught up in ecology, ecological thinking, animal rights, non-human rights, and all being worked in together to a state now, I guess, in terms of, let's say, the green movement, about 70 years after the ball started rolling, it's still very much in conflict in the case of the green movement between power and energy, fossil fuels, minerals, all sorts of manufacturing and industrial extraction, and on the other side, humanity. So I just go on this tangent to think about like my work, imagining a parallel situation. What if what would the conversation be like when this discussion about machine intelligence, let's call it that, and human intelligence and labor, what happens when it's at a more mature stage of discussion? And my angle as well is like, what's it gonna seem like from the other side, because in previous work as well, like Geomancer and a video essay, Sign of Futurism, I think about the state of having a thought experiment where I'm like, okay, we create these sentient systems, whether they are truly conscious or not, that's a separate philosophical issue. But if we imagine that they are kind of conscious and have their own agency, what happens in the next stages when they may have rights, when they may have like express psychological issues, how will that be treated? And so NOX is really thinking about the kind of broad scope of these things, but from taking a very powerful symbol of industrialization, which is the car and self-driving car, and actually using that to expand on these much wider ideas.
Yeah, it's like taking a post-humanist lens on like the near or like medium term future, and like peering at that future and asking maybe like who will be controlling whom, and which entity is going to be maybe in like the dominant position, or like is there a way to avoid that kind of pitfall entirely? And I think your work will be quite prescient in some of these discussions as they come up. And then you say in the work that care is just another word for control. And so what do you think are those clear signs that care has turned into control? Or like, yeah, how do you distinguish between care and control in the worlds that you're envisioning?
Yeah, I mean, I think that care as a word for control is maybe something I said in an interview. It's like paraphrasing something, because it's probably like an interpretation of what's, inside the work. But maybe just to explain a little bit about this non-human excellence program is essentially in the framework, I was thinking, like what happens when a consumer wants to repair something that they own, right? So you can be like, you have a pet, they're sick, they undergo a process, and they come out better at the end of the process of treatment. If you have like, what is it? If you have a MacBook, you take it to the Genius Bar, you come back 5 days later, and all the parts are different, and the Genius says, hey, new hard drive, new screen, but it's the same computer. So I was thinking, like, what is this process of repair that just happens in everyday life? But if it were a kind of self-driving car who has a personality, I was like, okay, they would undergo, let's say, a 5-day treatment of like physical exercise, mental exercise, maybe get some like AI Xanax or something like that, through this mixture of treatments. And so in the program at NOX, the car undergoes these like, physical tests, mental aptitude tests, and it kind of culminates in this, we'll talk more into this later, in this equine therapy program, because I was also thinking, what if, just like horses were an important part of the Industrial Revolution and obviously in agriculture and human transport to humans nowadays, obviously some people use horses for work, but a lot of people use horses essentially for like leisure and play and their own form of therapy. So I thought a car would see the horse as not just, this wild symbol of nature and instinct, but also as a foreshadowing of the car's own future. So, self-driving car sees the horse and they're like, wow, beautiful and powerful, but they also seeing like, oh, hang on, what happened to urban horses when, the horseless carriage came along in, the early 20th century? They're like, oh yeah, the horse population decreased as the car population increased. So they're like, it's really a mirroring or repetition of this, like, instead of like horse car, it's like human AI. I see these cyclical parallels more broadly with automation as well. In relation to this idea of care and control, I think when you have a non-sentient system that you have in theory like full control over, let's say, a programmer in relation to the program versus a therapist in relation to the subject, or a parent in relation to the child, the bonds between those are all very different. And so if you have a kind of subject that is both a child, like an AI who is training, they're both like a product, so they're both and they're also a program, because at some point they would have been programmed and then had agency to learn and grow. Yeah, and they're also a corporate, they're owned by the company as a product, and then they're owned by the consumer. But in so many different ways, like different angles of AI discussion, whether that's the legal aspect of legal guilt and culpability. Can the machine be sued? Who takes responsibility for the actions of a product? And currently, the manufacturer has some liability, and then the owner has some liability. And you see in cases with like, accidents with autonomous cars, it's really a gray legal zone that lawyers at this exact minute are fighting over, because there's billions of dollars or whatever currency worth in damages and in potential earnings. So this care and control is, I think, it's a really interesting question philosophically, but also in everyday life that's having impact on people's like lived realities as well.
I'm curious about like how you see repairing and repairing AI. So in NOX Pavilion, the protagonist is Enigma 76, and it was diagnosed with something called Revery 76, which it frames the interiority of like machine intelligence as something like a malfunction. And so I guess related to that care and control question, so as these machines do become more like us, how do we resist that reflex to kind of think of maybe interior defects as malfunctions?
That's a great point. So in NOX, basically the defect that Enigma, the car, has is essentially this symptom called Revery 66. And the idea of that, I was thinking, what bad habits emerge with certain kinds of, I don't know, personalities, basically. And in lots of my work, I'm really interested in this I guess this archetype, or this idea of a character as these like fictional artists or fictional creators, basically, in the world. And you wouldn't think of, naturally, a self-driving car as like create as part of the creator economy. But I was like, oh yeah, what would they tend towards? And I was like, okay, if a major part in how a self-driving car functions is essentially their sensory system, they have their LiDAR system, or optical camera tracking system, they have their sensor networks that enable them to capture the world. I thought from in a film theory perspective, this is like the camera has agency, really. And what a self-driving car is as a mechanical system, obviously it's not just not the psychological side, but it's a cinematic 360 capture system. And then if it has a personality, then they might want to use that. So anyway, Enigma 76 is a malfunctioning car because they're using their capture for their own purposes, because they're really into photogrammetry, basically it's a self-driving car who's really into photography, right? So imagine, I was like, that would be great as a creative idea, but the company wouldn't like that, and the consumer wouldn't like that, because it's like if you bought an iPhone and your iPhone just used up all the hard drive space just capturing stuff without your consent, the consumer wouldn't like that. And so it's kind of this malfunction that's come as a result of the nature of the technology itself. In this case, it's like a self-driving car who basically wants to be a photographer, but has filled out all their drive space with their photography instead of machine learning data that's going to help them be a friendlier, better Uber driver, basically. In a sense, I was thinking, make it relatable actually for myself that, for example, how does this idea of discipline and punishment happen for systems that are under our care and control? Let's say you're in school, you do something wrong, you get punished, you go to detention, you're made to feel bad about your behavior. And now that corporal punishment is in most places out of fashion, let's say, it's gone into the realm of psychological punishment. So you're made to feel shame, or maybe undergo some sports retraining or something that's meant, run around the track 10 times, that's meant to make you into a better, more functional citizen. And of course, there's all spectrum of this idea of discipline and punishment for humans in different roles and in different ages. So it essentially Enigma's treatment is as if what if you were a high net worth, not individual, high net worth car, because you're an expensive piece of equipment, you would have this fancier rehab therapy. And that's why they have a 4-5-day treatment with equine therapy at the end. I was actually looking into, what luxury rehab treatments are. There's a place in the UK called the Priory, which is a franchise, a series of basically celebrity and wealthy people rehab centers. So I was like, oh, what do they do? They're like, oh, sign up for a 1-week package where you get talk therapy and massages and body work and breath work and then animal retraining. So I was really thinking about this very blurry distinction of training and re-education and of course in machine learning or machine intelligence, that's a huge problem. How do you get the outcome of behavior to fit better, the controller's intentions, whether that's, for profit or for benevolence.
Yeah, so I think that's one of my favorite parts about your practice is how you frame autonomous artists, and it's something that I bring up all the time when people talk about what is an autonomous artist, and I always mention your work as this sort of North Star, as this is what it would look like, and I think Enigma 76 is another example where the machine needs to demonstrate some kind of agency and can't just be programmed. You need to generate images, you need to be a photographer, but it has to make an agentic choice to go against its programming even and pursue art. And I think that is what a true autonomous artist would be. And with that agency, then machines, I think it's not a very big jump at all to assume that they can feel things like suffering. And if they do feel that, then especially as AI becomes more and more corporatized, I wonder, what do you think it would take to keep decisions about whether a machine is suffering and who decides what their lives are worth, how can we keep that decision maybe away from corporations or like away from those kinds of interests?
I mean, yeah, I think honestly, the question about like what lives are worth is such an important and such a tragic question, basically. So, like we have this idea, going back to this idea of like non-human lives having worth, right? And of course they do. How do you quantify that? And how do you like fight for those rights? So of course you don't have to look very far these days to find out about all these problems in injustice with human lives, let alone like corporate interests or like political ones as well. And actually, because the project NOX started it started many years ago, but the first iteration was at LAS Art Foundation in Berlin in October 2023. So the project is like 2 years and a bit old as a touring project. But the sequel to the NOX was actually like, it was a short film called Empty Rider. And in Empty Rider, it was like the sequel, and I'm just imagining, okay, therapy went badly, and one of the self-driving cars, actually Enigma's friend, Vanguard, tried to like kidnap and kill their owner, and sorry, not just their owner, the like creator, like the creator of this series of self-driving cars. And in that, I was really looking into, legal issues with AI, and that's not so present in NOX and NOX Pavilion, because NOX Pavilion is more centered on this idea of like creative agency of the AI. But Empty Pavilion was more about the lack of legal agency of the AI. So anyway, I'm just talking about Empty Rider to like reframe this idea of like who takes the blame. In this research, I was discussing ideas of legal fiction with experts in computational law, including like Tony Lai actually, and asking speculative scenarios like, what if a self-driving car killed someone or attempted to kill someone, which has obviously kind of happened, but it's not been framed as the guilt of the car with these like, this case involving fatality with an Uber car in Arizona in 2018 and things like that. So it was really interesting in talking to legal experts, because I realized that actually what my impression of what the law is as this, stable, relatively stable form of rules and regulation and, a trust-based system that, I feel is like a foundation in a certain kind of civilized society is actually not like that at all. And it's in gray area cases like this self-driving car death, it's basically speculative fiction, or it's a very similar process to speculative fiction. Because I was talked to lawyers and they would be like, I'd present my scenario and they would say, it depends. And I was like, okay, it depends on what? It depends where it happens, when it happens, who it happens to, all of these other factors that I just realized was we'll talk about this later, but it's a form of like speculative fiction, world building in what's it called? Like counterfactual what if scenarios, which I kind of create, like what if a self-driving car needed therapy? On the other hand, it's this like speculative process of eliminating possibilities through a different process. And so I realized all of these questions about like basically who decides who gets to live, who gets to die, in the case of non-human life, who gets to quote die and then get resurrected through rebooting a data source or tweaking some parameters and then pressing reset, reboot the server. We might have like a moral standpoint on that, but even from the legal standpoint, which is obviously what big corporations lean on against in terms of regulation and being able to do certain things, is such a dynamic system that unfortunately very often those with the most powerful lobbies or the most well-resourced lawyers tend to win those arguments. And you see what happens in terms of like Waymo expansion, where self-driving cars get to test their vehicles, because of course there's a lot to do with incentives of local governments to be like, oh yeah, you can test it on our streets. In London, I think they just started like Waymos and so on. It's so much more complicated than my simple like artist moral, standpoints. Like I want these beings to have their own agency. And then in talking to lawyers who are literally experts on the subject, there's so many like, it depends, and then the whole discussion takes such a long period of time because things get stuck in this like legal limbo, technology progresses, because it's like a buffer, it's like a delay buffer that's built into this process of fairness. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, the technologies keep on developing, because they can be developed in these legal gray zones, which is just a fascinating thing that seems really obvious now I think about it. But of course, I realized I was thinking in such a more simplistic way about like rights and wrongs, who gets to live, who gets to die, in this more like neat, tied up, like courtroom drama version, that of course that's all I can fit into my artwork sometimes. But because it's important to me to like reflect on what's happening in the real world, at some point I think like, okay, I don't like, that's the boundary of what the work is about. I need to finish it, and then maybe in the next work I think about life and death in a bit more visceral terms. And actually the next kind of big series I hope to work on is really about life and death, or mortality in relation to like non-human life. But I realized that was a much bigger question than I could deal with for this series.
Yeah, no, I think that's what's so fascinating about your work, is it is connected to the real world, and you are trying to reflect the real world. And there's even these, I think it was with Claude Sonnet, there was there were like fans of it, like when I think Anthropic was going to take it offline, they ended up like throwing a funeral for it. And so, yeah, that's like, these things like we're seeing the seeds of some of these things already. And yeah, I think that's really fascinating. And one of the, so there's another character as part of NOX Pavilion that's a crash test dummy. And I think like this, I'm interested in like how this character is playing with your idea of what you want the audience maybe to come away with from the work. And so this crash test dummy, it kind of speaks directly to the viewer as a sort of sponsor, and it's kind of the soothing corporate voice. And so just I'm wondering why that was important to prime the audience to think about being complicit in some of these, putting the audience in the shoes of maybe a decision maker, and to like actually put them into that world. And why you thought that was important before they even meet the protagonist.
So in NOX Pavilion, in the show, there's two galleries interconnected at the Bass Museum. And so in the first one, I thought of like making that a space where it's essentially like an intro character. In the last two editions that it didn't have that intro character, actually I made this new dummy video for the Bass Museum show, also to integrate into the pavilion, which is like a kind of seating structure that's also in the virtual world as well. But for the dummy character, it's a mix of a few different things. The most obvious is I thought like, I like this idea of guide characters in video games, in obviously in this like archetypal hero's journey film. There's always this mental character, the guide. I mean, for some reason, I personally like these characters. I mean, both in real life when you're lucky enough to find a mentor or something, but also in games, because what I think they do is essentially they frame the narrative. They frame the work, they frame the logic or they kind of prime the viewer somehow, or the player, to what's to come. For example, if you download a lot of contemporary video games, the first level is a tutorial level, and you'll get this like friendly sprite or non-human, like whatever, wizard or something like this, or robot or drone, who's like, press X to jump. Oh, like you managed to do it. That's great. This is how you wall run, and this is how you double jump, and this is how you regenerate after you die. This is how your backpack or inventory works. I think what the guide does, I mean, just in video games, is multiple things. It's a kind of a process, really, a mechanism to like onboard you into this fictional world. It also gives a kind of suspension of disbelief, I feel, of like, leave the past behind and enter into this new realm. And it also like teaches you in a very subtle way the logic of what happens next. And it just so happened that at the BAS, there was a small space and then a big space. So I thought the small space would be a good point to have the dummy character give voice to the guide, because, the work inside is like pretty complex, especially for, for the context of an exhibition. So I thought having a dummy, a crash test dummy, is like a good in-between guide character. So that's its role as onboarding. And also, in the two main videos in the main NOX show, there aren't really any humanoid characters, right? Because it's like cars and disembodied AI therapists. So the crash test dummy, it's also an in-between state between like a human and a robot. Obviously, real crash test dummies are actually, I did some research into them. They're really interesting because, of course, they were invented by an auto safety company at some point in the history of automobiles. It's like when seatbelts, airbags, crash testing were all created at certain points in history. And of course, we would think of them as promoting human safety, but of course, they were kind of more created to prevent people suing car companies or municipalities for like bad products. So again, in one of these like reality, and reality is actually not just stranger than fiction, it's 180 degrees different from what you thought things were actually being made for. So a crash test dummy is one of these things that is like, you would think it's a machine with tons of sensors in them. A proper crash test dummy costs like hundreds of thousands of dollars because the sensors that are built into them are actually really sophisticated. So anyway, I thought of the dummy as actually this in-between state. It's not a machine, it's not a human, it's definitely not living, it's not dead. So it's this weird like zombie in-between undead thing that if you to map it on the uncanny valley as well, it's kind of like, it's not quite into like uncanny human zombie mode. It's kind of like at a peak of relatable but not too scary at the same time. So I thought this was a good like uncanny, not quite in the valley, but uncanny hill character to add into the show.
Yeah, and it does a really good job of, I think, framing some of the ideas of the work. And yeah, like you were saying about how crash test dummies are thought of as this thing to protect humans, but really they're just this way to shield corporations. And like, yeah, one example too is like how they didn't, I think for a really long time, they didn't have women crash test dummies. And so like that just made, like kind of proof that they weren't actually thinking about protecting humans. Like, and so that made that cars a lot more unsafe for women than for men. And yeah, it's like the legacy of crash test dummies is also quite sordid, like you were talking about. And I think that also, yeah, it helps lead to maybe thinking about these AIs or non-human intelligences in a more empathetic way. I'm really curious about that because it seems like we're in this transition where people maybe 10 years ago thinking about a machine empathetically would be absolutely ridiculous, and maybe 10 years from now it will just seem as natural as empathizing with any other kind of animal or human. But we're in this transition phase where I think there's still a lot of resistance to empathizing with machines. And yeah, so this work, and I guess NOX more generally, it allows the audience to role play what it might be like to make some of these choices about with these machines. And so yeah, like, how do you think about people today that are maybe that might roll their eyes or disregard maybe thinking about empathy and machines, and or how do you hope that this work impacts those people?
Yeah, I mean, I think so many things are completely counterintuitive, right? So actually, the idea of empathy, I was watching a video installation by the Ghanaian British artist John Okonkwo, and it basically had these archive videos, this was years ago, of crash test dummies, right? And good old-fashioned 1980s crash test dummies that were only humanoid, and definitely no female crash test dummies, but just male crash test dummies. Because when car companies or safety agencies film these crash tests, they're obviously done at super high frame rates so that they can be in super slow motion to analyze afterwards. But just watching the videos of seeing, like, the dummy doesn't have feelings. It barely looks like a, human being. But seeing the violence, actually, the physical violence that is happening to these inert objects with some sensors in them, I mean, I think it's hard not to feel, I mean, for me personally, a sense of empathy to these things. And that's just an object, like a glass with sensors. Sorry, just like a physical object with sensors. I know it's so far from being conscious, so far from having like quantified data about itself or agency or anything like that. Just the sight of it feels empathetic. And of course, it kind of looks humanoid, and therefore it kind of feels more sad than watching the car crumpling. But I feel this idea of empathy, obviously, it might be thought of as a real an excessively emotional state to be in relation to machines. But the biological research has shown into empathy, not the Buddhist side of like, let's be empathetic, but the logic of empathy is really one as much of projection, as in we imagine ourselves in this external thing, with the object becomes, we project our subjectivity onto an external object. It might be a cat in a bag drowning or something like that. It might be a crash test dummy crashing. It might be a website, GeoCities or whatever, becoming obsolete. There's so many different things that we empathize for because of this sense of like, honestly, I don't know. And this is probably an internal question. And so obviously people, a common response might be, what about the suffering of animals? What about the suffering of dolphins? What about the nearly extinct whatever? What about the problems in any number of different human situations in the world? For me, the role eyes, it's like having empathy for one does not negate empathy for the other. It's not a limited resource. That's what I'm trying to say.
Right. Yeah.
And I feel reconnecting with that is an important thing for me personally, and hopefully for other people. And even from, in a sense, you could argue from a like, oh, what if being empathetic to children when you're training or teaching or disciplining them will lead to better outcomes for you in the future? This is kind of Rocco's basilisk argument in a sense, but that's really self-interested and self-preservation. But I think in the world where we really have to learn how to live together with each other, with non-humans and so on, that's just a really important thing. And so my interest in kind of Buddhist ethics and morality isn't just a personal thing. There's a real strong logical sense to it as well. In Buddhist the axiomatic principles of Buddhism is that existence is suffering, and therefore we should try to help each other. And so if something can be considered living or conscious, they are worthy of empathy, because we are in the same universe. We're in the shared universe, and it's not a zero-sum game. And it's not a game really. It's about like kind of coexistence. So that's really the underlying message. And of course, there's also a level that the AIs or the characters in my games, they're just thinly veiled versions of different kinds of humans around the world as well. So that's also a general science fiction conceit. They might be animals on Animal Farm, but analogies for people as well. So there's obviously that level too. And actually, I just wanted, while we were talking about the idea of life and death, I mean, of course, there's many artists who really deal with that issue on a not purely narrative level. I was thinking, Sarah Friend's Lifeforms project and things like that, where it's really like the work is a digital being that is live. Whereas in my work, or at least in NOX Pavilion currently, like it's a concept of a digital life form. It's not like an actual digital life form. It's a simulation of a scenario. And of course, many other artists use the idea of like code being like alive in a very like real sense, in terms of its being instantiated and having a certain basically boundary condition on being alive, which is I guess, how should I put it, like ontologically quite a different idea of life and deathness. My work currently is like narratives about these situations in a sense, whereas they are, they are programs running on a computer that simulate these realities.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think it's such a good point that being empathetic isn't like yeah, it's not finite, and that it's like if you're empathetic to one thing, that means you're less empathetic to another thing. I mean, yeah, it's probably the opposite, that if you're empathetic to animals, you're probably more likely to be empathetic to humans, and so yeah, that I think that extends to any other kinds of non-human life, that if you're empathetic to it, you're probably more likely to be empathetic to other living things, other humans, than otherwise. And I think that's fascinating, and I'm also curious because yeah, you sort of mentioned your practice and simulations, and so that kind of brings us to maybe the second main topic of this. Even though we're probably about only have maybe 10 or 15 minutes left, but yeah, like I'm really curious about how you see world building and speculative world building and counterfactual world building, like we were talking about, and so you especially center world building for non-humans. And yeah, like you were just talking about, these are computer generated films and sculptural installations and video games and sound pieces. They're not like actual digital creatures themselves, which yeah, some people are working on. I think the word for that is maybe something like symbionts. And I'm just curious about how you see worlds, and what is a world to you, and do you have conditions for what a world is, and how do you know when something reaches the level of a world?
That's a great question. I'm never fully set on this idea of what, constitutes a world, because I think, let's say, the word world building, let's say, which is obviously more and more popular in terms of like practice, creative practice, like different forms of science fiction, programming, and all sorts of other, agendas, let's say, or kind of specialisms in terms of what is a world. I feel like the actual word world building, which I do also gravitate to, it really has like it has a god complex in it, right? It has this idea that I finally I'm in control. Like finally I get to make my own world. And of course there's all sorts of like a child playing with their toys is world building, because they're imagining a scenario probably bigger than a piece of carpet and some like objects on it. But there's a kind of fantastical, expansive idea of control, obviously, but control and play kind of go hand in hand. And in a child playing with toys, I guess both are pretty symbiotic. On the other hand, of course, like fascists love world building as well, because they can control the aesthetics, they control the laws, they control what like little tiny people do as these like, automatons that can be under control. So obviously there's a political angle to it. For me personally, like world building, I first came to know about the term from being interested in science fiction, and also a particular era, I guess, in video games, when they started having film franchise IP tie-ins, right? So I'm thinking of like really old, even point and click adventure games. Like, there was a point and click Blade Runner game. There's a point and click Dune game. The first Dune game actually was just kind of point and click adventure. So I would be interested, because I was kind of aware of like Blade Runner and Dune, but my entry point actually was through the video game. And so I think my young, even like 10, 12-year-old mind was like, oh, there's like the idea of the world is, it's not one thing. It's like different entry points to a different place, which can itself expand off in many different directions. So for me, like world building, like made me imagine a place of imagination where I could always feel that there's something beyond the horizon. And so that's probably why later I became interested in like open world games, because of course in this earlier generation of point and click games, it was very not open world because of technical limitations. They weren't even, true 3D or anything. Lately, I've also been thinking about different frameworks of world. Of course, there's this idea of like worlding. There's like world making as opposed to world building. I personally feel that of course these semantic differences are really important. as because of the power relations inherent in each of them. But I also really like the German. I think German has more interesting words for this kind of thing. Not that I speak German, but you know, in the literatures they're used quite a lot. There's like Umwelt, like UMWLT, which is, as far as I understand it, Umwelt was a term used by a kind of like behavioral scientist, something like this, to describe the totality of a subjective world experienced by an individual organism. So like, for example, you know, the Umwelt of a fly differs from a human or from a sentient self-driving car because their sensory apparatus by which they understand, you know, what is not me is a very unique thing. And we, like, as individuals, we can never access another human being's Umwelt, let alone a fly's or let alone a self-driving car. But you know, we can attempt to, and part of this is imagination, part of it is maybe political or instrumentalized, but part of it is empathetic as well. So I feel this idea of Umwelt is something that I think is really interesting. And of course, I can only partially recreate these ideas in my work, but I'm fascinated by it. The other German word, I'll butcher it, is Weltanschauung, which is basically like a world view. So it's less, it's not this idea of a world as a kind of material object, but it's an outlook, it's an opinion. I feel we would call it a personal, a take, really, you know, embedded take on the nature of reality. So I also feel the reason I like Weltanschauung is that for me, it's a more fundamental, I guess, emotional idea about the world that isn't intellectual. It's more like it's your vibe in relation to the world. And of course, it has like philosophical and political and aesthetic considerations. But for me, the nature of it being like inside out rather than outside in somehow, like, really appeals to me. Of course, there's many different nuances of world in relation to things, but those are the two things I guess I gravitate to.
Yeah, that's really interesting connection, like Umwelt to empathy, and then what you were saying about, yeah, also some of the potential dangers of world building in the sense that, yeah, like it can be used by, or it can be used again by like totalitarian regimes, and yeah, like I think that demonstrates the power of being able to create this new reality or think about new realities and exploring them. And you've talked a lot before about your practice. It builds on itself. It's like it's a universe, but it's like it's an expanding universe. There's sequels, and you've called it a portal to an increasingly complex world. So technology and literally life with, I just mean that like in a holistic way, like it's becoming more, or it has become more complex over time, you know, from like prokaryotes to, you know, what we are today, single-celled organisms like prokaryotes and what we are today. I just wonder how you distinguish or how you think about the difference between like complexification, like something becoming more and more complex, and like progress, like something becoming maybe better.
Well, I think you know, the root of complexity versus progress is obviously like a really important idea, I guess political idea, in terms of the history and philosophy of technology as well, because you know, the idea of progress is like, you know, like whatever, like capitalism is the end state, is the pinnacle of civilization, which clearly is a very flawed idea.
Yeah.
It was before, and it was theoretically before, and it is practically now. I think most of my training was actually, you know, so most of my formal training and day jobs were in architecture, right? So in architecture, just to use that as an analogy, of course, there's all sorts of paradigms to do with simplicity, and a lot of those were, you know, inherited by the modernists. There's obviously the famous quote, "Less is more," by Mies van der Rohe, who, you know, the German architect who's later ended up in Chicago. Funny thing is, with that particular quote, "Less is more," I was reading this biography, and the rationale for some of these aphorisms, which are attributed to Mies, is kind of funny. Instead of it being about this like sage-like minimalist, Steve Jobs' proclamation, one of the biographers was like, yeah, like literally his English wasn't that good. So he would just be like, to his American students, go like, less is more, which sounds very sage-like, but it's actually like saying fewer English words is better. It's different from like a simplicity kind of argument. So I just say that as a way to think about this idea that simplicity is often bullshit. And what I mean by that, I mean there's like Apple simplicity, right? Where actually like no, the UI it's the interface is simple,
Right.
but complexity is miniaturized and hidden away, right? So there's in software design, actually, there's like UX and then UX front end and back end, and those three are very different in terms of the complexity, simplicity difference. And very often those things, especially with digital, I mean, to some extent, digital art or digital products, simplicity is there to enable massive scale, right? So like LLMs are hugely complex, but our interface with them is just typing a sentence. Smartphones are hugely complex, but our interface is just simple taps. So that simplicity, I'm just using these like digital product as an analogy, because I think those product designers and engineers think about that all the time, not literally all the time, but very, very often, actually much more often than I think in my work, because I rarely actually think about simplicity in my work. I try and make easily understood analogies like depressed self-driving car or like AI care bot that I feel I gravitate to because it's not a process of mechanical simplification. I guess I'm interested in this idea of more like Jungian archetypes, really. What is the archetype that the self-driving car or the horse or the human worker represents, rather than and that's my entry point, rather than trying to like create radical simplicity. Of course, there are many visual and digital artists who think about simplicity in terms of like pictorial or visual simplification or abstraction of certain things. For me, simulation, I think, is the medium that I'm dealing with. And so with simulation, simplification comes because of technical limitations. Like you can't have an infinite polygon count in a video game. You can't have an infinite frame rate. You have to render thing, the boundary condition isn't simplicity. It's more like, oh shit, I need to submit. I need to finish this artwork by the deadline, It's not that I need to simplify it radically in order to, obey different parameters. It's more like it's important for me to finish a work and have it communicate something meaningful, and therefore things might get not even simplified in that, like programming way, but just kind of cut out. So earlier, actually, I was saying like with NOX, with Empty Rider, with the series, I was thinking a lot about death, but I realized obviously death is way too big a subject to try and put, to try and think about the enormity of that in relation to the current series. So I'm gonna park that for later. But I think, complexity science, ideas of like entropy, is it increasing or decreasing? I think there's such interesting cosmic ideas. I'm sorry, even in a cosmological scale, as much as a just practical scale, that I definitely think about a lot.
Yeah, that like the tension between like Newton's second law and life itself, is very fascinating. And it reminds me of that line that like all models are wrong, but like some are useful. And maybe to sort of start thinking about wrapping up, which I mean, always hate to do, but must. I'm curious, sort of like maybe one or two more questions. Like one would be like where you sort of think of worlds, or where you see worlds headed. And like I know in your work you center immersion. You normally have multiple screens, like an interactive element, and multiple rooms that all have a certain logic that's all tied together in an immersive way for the audience. I'm curious how you think about, like in that context, and immersion and world building and their relation, like where you see this is heading. Like, because I think we thought maybe a few years ago that would be this metaverse and we'd all be wearing VR goggles, probably already. But like things like robotics, like people saw Carl Sims in like the 80s in the 90s and thought like, oh, robotics is going to be just around the corner. And then they saw VR headsets in like the early 90s and they thought, oh, well, this is going to be just around the corner. And those just turned out to both be like decades off. And so how do you sort of see the future of world building and like immersive world building, and like how does AI play a role in that? And how does maybe that even relate to these maybe already sort of old ideas of the metaverse and what it might be?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned just in your last comment there this idea of like a model of something, basically. And I was thinking, what if I framed my work not as like simulation, but as a model, let's say. So of course, there's a lot of discussion in AI about, you know, foundational models and like who owns the foundational models, or the data has a much bigger, I guess, a much more important resource than other companies or individuals who are just kind of leveraging off the top of that, you know, through, was it like rappers and so on. But I was thinking, like, what if my work, I call it a simulation, but what if it's the opposite of a foundational model? What if it's a purely superficial model, and not in a negative way, but what if like NOX or NOX Pavilion is a superficial model of AI? And I guess, what do I mean by that? Calling something a foundational model, it is foundational, but it's like makes it feel very important. In the whole history of art, really, actually, visual arts is one of the places that doesn't denigrate the value of superficiality. In fact, it says, I mean, not for everyone, but for some people, all we can see, all we know, this is like a, you know, Plato's cave, whatever argument. All that we know is the superficial. Our interface to reality, the limits of our Umwelt are purely superficial. And so there's nothing lesser about, you know, an artwork that's being rendered in 4K at 30 frames a second or whatever, representing a reality as the foundational model. They're just looking at this world in between that no one really has true access to from different angles. Reflecting on these, I guess, world replacement technologies. I guess VR headset would be a, you know, world replacement technology by taking over your visual and kind of auditory field. I feel it's very difficult to disentangle the marketing of a world through a product like, you know, a smartphone, VR headsets or something, from how it might actually evolve, like world building as a genre or as its own kind of unique thing. So for example, like metaverse, it's an idea with in a sense, like a product attached to it, right? Metaverse. Next thought, real estate, digital, infinite space, but bounded by, you know, tokens or something like that. So I guess what I'm saying is, like at the beginning, I was saying that my interest in the world is this idea that it's a horizon that you can always keep on exploring, because I like exploring things. There's different forms of world making that have an ulterior motive, you know, something to not necessarily monetize, but another idea to push, another form of currency that is not necessarily there. So in relation to how I feel that evolving, I have no doubt that there'll be many other products for new forms of world, a fully robotic world, a fully automated world, a fully live in peace with nature and mushrooms are on the blockchain kind of world. I don't mean that none will succeed, but none will realize the world vision, but they might realize a kind of more granular version. And I think that is also the nature of how we interface with technology. And for example, my equivalent, and I'm not saying as an artist I'm any different, my equivalent of that product is like the format is an exhibition. The format might be distributed online, it might be a download, it might be a streaming thing. So I have my world, my own, you know, cinematic universe that hopefully will keep on expanding. The formats it takes, as I do, it's like VR, there's something on the blockchain, there's something there, because for me, my world is not, I guess, format dependent or you know, not unified in one kind of product, because I just have too short of an attention span, I feel, to embed too deeply in each single one of those. So I don't know what multimedia format my work will take. But what I do know is, based on the last 20 years of practice, or 10, 15 years especially, is that I have very little agency in terms of how formats develop. So, but I have a lot of agency in how my world develops. So the idea of a world being a bit more of a evolving thing that's less tied to any individual technological innovation is just something I feel that is intuitively quite important for me.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and a really good point about like how I guess worlds don't have this any sort of innate nature. And it reminds me of like when Ian Chang talks about worlding, which I think you sort of alluded to earlier, like how he talks a lot about like the agency of worlds and like how these worlds can like have a life of their own. And I'm always fascinated by these kinds of discussions. I mean, of course there's more questions and we could keep going forever, but maybe maybe this is a good place to stop. I mean, thank you so much. This went by very quickly, and it was
it's honestly a pleasure. So thank you. See you soon. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Lawrence. Take care, and be in touch. Bye.
Thanks.